The other day I was watching Linux Sucks 2021 during a live stream, and Lunduk said something during it that made me want to go and make a video. Basically what he said was that over the past year, systemd has had tons and tons of lines added into it, and this is crazy because it's just an init system. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that's the general gist of what he said. And from people that hate systemd, this is a very common complaint, that your init system doesn't need over 1 million lines of code. But the thing is, this is just frankly not true. Not the fact that your init system does need over 1 million lines of code, or that systemd doesn't have over 1 million, it's the fact that the init system in systemd frankly doesn't have over 1 million lines of code, because systemd isn't a single piece of software. I don't know how this myth ever started, because the systemd website and the systemd documentation has never described systemd as an init system. It's always described it as a software suite. I'm not here to argue that systemd or any of the tools contained within it are actually good at their job, or if they're efficient or easy to use, easy to work with, anything like that. I don't think that's really relevant to the point of today's video. Personally, I don't have an issue running systemd on my system, but that's just my experience. If you're going to have a problem with systemd, though, at least know what you're actually complaining about. Okay then, so what is systemd? Well, as it says on the systemd website, systemd is a suite of basic building blocks for a Linux system. It provides a system and service manager that runs as PID1 and starts the rest of the system. Okay, that's all well and good, but what does that actually mean? We all know the meme that Linux is just the Linux kernel, and then to provide the useful functionality in the user space, we go and download the GNU tools to give us things like CP, ls, rm, awk, sed, and all of that stuff that Linux is known for that actually makes it useful. But that's not the only software we have installed on our system. Just downloading the GNU suite isn't actually going to make the kernel actually do anything. So we're going to need some sort of bootloader to actually start up the kernel, and that's what systemd boot provides. And then once the kernel's actually started, we need to have some sort of init system, and systemd has an init system built into it. But we also need some, say, logging to actually make sure if anything goes awry on our system, we know what's actually gone wrong. That's what systemd journal D does. We need something to do timed jobs. Well, that's what systemd timer does. We need some networking. That's what systemd network D does. And the list goes on and on and on and on for all of these very low-level tasks that makes our system just work the way we would expect it to work. I think this next part is definitely where some of the confusion actually comes from, and that is the way that distro maintainers actually talk about their distro. Now, obviously, it's not their responsibility to make sure you know what you're actually talking about, but it definitely doesn't help. And that is, if we go and download an ISO for a distro, let's say we download Foo Linux, and you can download it with OpenRC, Runit, sysv, and systemd. So 3 of these are definitely init systems. The first 3 absolutely are. There's no question about that. But then the last one doesn't really make sense to be in the same category, because if we get rid of systemd as our init system, we're probably not just changing the init system, we're probably also changing things like our timer implementation, swapping over to something like, say, a cron implementation. We'll probably need some sort of new bootloader, maybe something like grub. And that's the big difference. When you have systemd on your system, generally systemd is going to be used for more than just the init. One thing to note though is if you have systemd installed, you don't actually have to use all of it. Now obviously you could just choose to have all of systemd installed and just not use the applications, but that's not what I mean. What I actually mean is that if you install systemd, you don't need everything installed. You can just have the core components installed, which I believe are the init and the journaling system, and the rest of it is actually completely optional. So most people, when they install systemd, they're installing it as a binary package. They don't really care about how it's actually being compiled. It's just from their system's package manager, and it just installs most of the suite without thinking. But if you go and compile it yourself, you actually can go and enable and disable certain parts with compile flags. And if you don't compile certain parts, They just won't be installed. So this allows you to have systemd managing parts of your system without having it manage everything that it possibly can. So if you want to have something different for your networking or your timers or your bootloader, you can very well go and do that without having to worry about the systemd application actually being installed alongside of it. I imagine the reason why most distros don't really bother doing this though is because if you're going to be using systemd to actually manage your distro, it only makes sense to commit to fully using systemd. Otherwise, why bother with the suite in general? It's not like the different tools that manage your system don't operate nicely together. It's just that there's not really any reason to go and do that when you have this entire suite that manages everything in your system anyway. I understand why some people don't like that idea, but from the distro maintainer's perspective, I imagine it makes things much, much easier. Now, there are legitimate problems with systemd that might make you not want to use it. Things like, say, the performance. Systemd, while it isn't going to be the slowest possible way you can manage your system, you could very easily make something worse. Systemd isn't intended to be the fastest init system or the fastest journaling system or the fastest timers or anything like that. And you can find them say this in their FAQ. They sometimes chose to go with a slower implementation because it was going to be a way to make the codebase easier to manage. And when you have a codebase that large, sometimes that is a decision that you have to decide to make. Is it okay to sacrifice a couple of milliseconds here to make this entire function way more readable? Depends on what you're trying to do. In their case, they decided, okay, sure, we will do that. So if absolute speed is more important to you, maybe something else out there is going to be much better at the job. Another complaint that I hear is about lines of code. Now, I've talked about lines of code before and why they don't really mean anything, but I know there are some people out there who have a massive hard-on for lines of code. And on a source-based distro, this actually does matter because more lines of code means more to compile. That's a perfectly valid reason. And it will make binaries a little bit bigger. Not noticeably in most cases, but when you have like an extra 100,000 lines, sure, that definitely is going to be a problem. Minimal lines of code also just isn't a goal of the project. Another problem with systemd is because some of its applications try to do stuff in their own unique way, not trying to be compatible as their main goal, but still having compatibility be there if it is needed. Some applications out there basically depend on the systemd applications actually being there. One notable case is with GNOME. Now, in the GNOME case, you actually can get it working without systemd. It is just a lot of extra work that requires a lot of extra fiddling. It's not like you can just install it like you can on the systemd system and it just magically works. And there are plenty of other things out there that may be potential problems stopping you from running systemd. But this is why having choice on your Linux system is such a great thing. You can choose to go and run systemd, choose something like Arch, or you could go and run something like Artix and just completely ignore it altogether. Go run something like OpenRC, go and install individual applications to manage the rest of your system, and you're good to go. Personally, I'm running Arch Linux, so I run systemd. And I don't really have any love or hate for it. It doesn't really do anything that makes me really think about it. It just does its job in the background, and that's basically it. I don't need to ever think about it. But if you want to have a discussion about why systemd is bad and why nobody on Linux should ever run it, please know what you're actually talking about and understand that it was never and is never going to be an init system. The init system is just one little part of systemd. And not understanding that distinction makes your arguments sound considerably worse. That's it for me, and before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim Donald, Logan Michael, Andrew Mitchell Nathan, David Carl Will, Brennan, Chico Bento, Jamie Joseph Josh, Michael, Peter D, Stephen Tees through, Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you'd like to support work, there are links down below to my Patreon, subscribe, side, leave a that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brody Robertson Plays, available on YouTube. I don't know why I said that part. I live stream twice a week, and I upload about 5 or so YouTube shorts, and this channel's available over on Odyssey. That's it for me, and I'm out.